Okay, welcome to part 4 of our equine pasture management series. This one is going to cover summer survival, which is becoming a hot topic right now, literally and figuratively. And that prior to the last few days, we've had some pretty hot weather and pretty dry weather, what we consider especially for a spring weather. So it's kind of getting us prepped ahead of time. But the reason we like to do this one in early April is it gives you a few options that you can still pursue before we get to the hot summer months. So we're going to focus in on that. You look at the picture here, it looks like probably what it did last fall, but some of you may feel like every summer this is kind of what you're feeling like with your horses are out on, a bunch of dry stuff, especially if you've got fescue. It really dries up and becomes difficult for you to manage or be able to pull any nutrition off of. So we're going to try to give you some options along the way that might help you in this area. So the first 2 or 3 slides that we're going to go through are a little bit of a review, but I think it's really important that we kind of hit back on these basics so that you understand where we're coming from when we're talking about some of these options for summer survival. So these are just growth curves that we have when we talk about our cool season grasses, most importantly, tall fescue. You can see it rise in. Right now we're in this peak time. We're not seeing all the growth that we would like to see at this point. It's really kind of reduced, but we should be right at that peak period for our tall season or our tall fescue cool season forages. So we start to get towards the end of May, middle of May, June, July, they're really going to start to regress. And then we get to those really hot months in June, July, August, September, it's really in that swale. And then if we get a typical fall and it's nice and cool, we're going to see a nice little peak or bump up again. And so we hope that's a good opportunity to get some rains, put some fertilizer on there maybe, and we can get another bump out of our forages. But the problem is always the summer period. So what do we do during that summer period? And then we get into our warm season grasses, which oftentimes we think of Bermuda when we think of that. And it's kind of got just the opposite. It's got this May. It's really starting to come on. Actually, in April, we're starting to see it. You might look at Bermuda and start to see some kind of greening on the ends of the blades of grass. Just starting to get going. We get to those really hot months, June, July, August. It's really where it's at its peak time. It's going to be functioning at its peak level. And then we start to tail off September, October. And then when we get that first really solid freeze, you'll see it just absolutely knock back. And that's also a good time to tell how much cool season grasses you actually have is during after that first freeze, because all those warm season grasses and weeds will die back. And the only thing left will be most likely your cool season grasses. So that's a good time to tell. But so there's our 2 little growth curves. Like I said, the warm season are really going to grow well as we get into these hot seasons. And I wanted to go back through this because I think this is really important to grasp. If you can grasp this, you can manage your pastures. And this is just how our grass grows. So when our grass first starts growing, it's all growing by the energy that is stored in the roots and the crown of this plant. And so up until we get to 3 inches, it doesn't really have much surface area on the leaves to be able to grow by photosynthesis, which is where all of the growth really occurs. So up until 3 inches, it's just growing by the root system. As we grow and get to bigger and bigger and broader leaves, more space, more surface area, the more sunlight we can bring in and trap, the more that we can actually grow. And so this plant, when you get to 3 inches, from 3 to 9, you're going to see a lot more rapid growth than you will from 0 to 3. So that's why we like to see our plants not get below 3, because we'll get a lot of rapid growth from 3 to 9 inches. And so that's where we like to keep it. That's where we get our most efficient, and that's where you're going to get your highest quality grasses, is from 3 to 9 inches. We get it over here into this phase 3 is where we're starting to get into reproductive time, where the plant's getting above 9 inches. It's starting to get more rigid. It's going into diverting all of its nutrients to reproductive phase. So it's all that's going to seed head. And so it's not worried about the nutrition of the plant, the quality of it. So it starts to go down. So the thing to remember out of here is this 3 to 9 inches. And if you can understand kind of science behind it, because it has more surface area on the leaf, that gives it more ability to trap sunlight and a faster ability to recover and grow. So if you get below the 3 inches, it's going to take it a long time to grow because it doesn't have much leaf, and it's having to get all of its energy from its roots, which is not the most efficient way to do it. And so this is just a review of the few of the grasses that we have, and we'll focus, like I said, continually over here in this warm season. Most of us, what we think of is Bermuda grass. You might hear Bahia grass. That's typically going to be really at the bottom end, most likely the northern end of the Alabama border. We don't see too much of that coming into Tennessee. We still get a little too cool for that. But Bermuda grass is our typical perennial warm season grass. We might come over here and see crabgrass. This is really starting to take off a little bit. We have a few varieties. Most people think of common crabgrass in their yards and how they hate having it there. But it has actually become a tool that we can use. Red River crabgrass is one example that we can plant out there and get forage quality value out of it. Now, an annual means that you're going to have to plant it every year, but it works well as a forage. It doesn't have quite the nutritional value of some of our other annuals, cool season, but it does work in those spots where you might not get anything else to grow, or you're looking for a warm season grass. Teff grass is kind of one of the hot names right now. This is a great forage or a great hay forage. It is not great for pasture. It is also an annual. One of the difficulties with teff grass is it's got a very, very fine blade, and so it gets up over 4 or 5 inches. And as it starts to grow up, it starts to fall over on itself and can actually kind of kill itself out. But it's got a very high nutritional value on it. It works great for hay, like I said, but it just for pasture grazing, it just does not work very well. But you do have to make sure if you do go the teff grass way for hay, is you are going to have to cut it quite frequently. It's going to grow pretty rapidly. But Bermuda is our primary perennial that we're going to talk about for warm season grasses. As we come into it, just kind of talking about warm season grasses, some advantages and disadvantages as we start thinking about it before we get into really trying to apply it. And so the advantages are, it's fast growing. During the summer, you see fast-growing weeds, and you're also going to see fast-growing warm season grasses. You cut your crabgrass one week, and the next week it's double its size, and the same thing goes for Bermuda. This stuff really gets going, and the key for it and the real advantage we have is it grows when our fescue is like really starting to collapse. When it gets really hot and dry, this stuff is really starting to take off, and it can actually use a remarkably low amount of water and still continue on growing. But there are some issues that we're going to talk about as far as the drought with Bermuda grass. But overall, it can take a lot of hot and dry weather and still keep on growing. So it becomes a real advantage when our fescue is melting. Weed control, it can do a great job of weed control. And when I talk about that, in fescue pastures, we talked about the spots where the fescue died out, or was grazed too short. All of a sudden now you have a bare spot where fescue is not just going to all of a sudden pop up and grow. But Bermuda grass, the way it grows, and we can kind of illustrate it right on here. I've got different grasses in the way they grow. Tall fescue grows in what we call a bunch. So when you first plant it, you got one seedling, and that will kind of bunch out a little bit. It might bunch out in a few inches, but it's not going to grow beyond those few inches. That becomes that bunch grass. So it's going to stay right here. If this plant dies, you now have this big bare spot. When we come over here and talk about Bermuda grass, it's got a stolon. And so it grows from that seedling, and then you can get one growing up. But then it also is going to have a stolon that creeps along the ground and can continue offshooting different blades. And so what can happen is if you had the Bermuda grass in that spot where the tall fescue was, it can now fill in that hole. Instead of a weed filling it in, this grass can now fill it in. So it does kind of work as weed control. And then also when we talk about inputs, we don't necessarily see the need for as much of the inputs. We talk about our potassium, nitrogen, things like that. It obviously has to have it, but maybe not the load that we typically see on tall fescue. Now, if you do put the nitrogen to it, it will really benefit, and you can really get a lot of production out of your Bermuda grass if you add the inputs to it. But in general, maybe you don't need as many to keep it going. And so I've kind of shown that along here and shown that height as well. So, and we'd like to see it probably a little bit higher, just the 3 inches, but you can kind of see how all these grass grow. And so the growing point, where it really starts to grow, will probably be closer a little bit to 3 inches, but you can kind of get an idea of the way these grasses grow. When we get to the disadvantages, we showed it in the first part, it's just got a shorter grazing period. You talk about cool season, they've got the spring and the fall, even kind of approaching a little bit into the winter. But for warm season, you see it's brown all year long. So it's brown all through the spring for the most part. Fall and winter, it's all brown. So our growing and grazing period are pretty short. We just have the summer period, and the rest of the time it's brown. So especially if you're into looking at a nice, beautiful green pasture in the middle of the winter, you're not going to get that with Bermuda grass, but it does have its other perks along the way. And then control. This is one of the biggest issues when we get into it, is you need to be purposeful wherever you're putting it, because just like we talked about how it will fill in and use weed control, it goes wherever it wants to go. So unless you have a really good stand of fescue, if you plant this stuff right next to your fescue, it will start to creep into your fescue. And there's just not a good way to control it, because it is a grass, so you can't just spray it if you've got other fescue in it. So it becomes very difficult. And unless it's in its growing period, you could spray Roundup on this stuff when it's dormant, like in the winter, and it not affect it much at all. So those are kind of some advantages and disadvantages just from the actual physiology of the plant. When we get into a little bit of the nutrition, we won't go too much into this because there's a lot of other areas that we can get into when we go into nutrition. But in general, a lot of people really like some of these Bermuda grasses because they have lower sugar content or lower non-structural carbohydrates. And part of that is because there's less surface area to have big green leaves, less surface area to be bringing in sunlight. So overall, a lot of people like it when it comes to having horses that have metabolic syndrome or obese horses. They like it because it has less of these non-structural carbohydrates or less sugars in there. Photosynthesis, and so just to reflect back a little bit, we talked about, when we were talking about especially these obese horses, and they talk about during the spring when the grasses are at kind of the richest content, they have their highest sugar content. How do we manage those? And so something to remember is that when we talk about fescue, cool season forage, tall fescue, it is at its highest peak of sugar content in the late afternoon or early evening. It's been taking on sun all day long. And so when it gets to that very end of the day, that's when it's had the most sun. So that's when it's had the highest sugar content. Then all through the night, it respires, uses that energy. So by the next morning, that's the point where your lowest sugar content is in the morning. So a lot of times people think they'll come home and turn out their horses in late evening because they're trying to restrict how much time they're on the pasture, but you're actually turning them out on a time when it's at its highest sugar content. So you need to be thinking about, if you're going to do restrictive grazing, to do that early in the morning when the tall fescue is at its lowest sugar content. But that's what we get into here with the Bermuda. It just has less surface area, less leaf coverage, and so we don't necessarily have as high of non-structural carbohydrates or sugar content. The one exception is if we do get extreme drought, what can happen is these plants, they're taking on sun all day long, and the way they use it and respire it and get rid of it is by growing. And if you get to a point where they haven't had any water for a long, long period of time, they're just storing all of this sugar in these the blades of grass. And so typically when you think that they're going to have lower sugar content, it may be higher during this time if you've got an extreme drought and the grass isn't growing, it's just storing the sugar content. And then the final thing we get into it is, some people think it has lower digestibility, and it can, but a lot of this goes back to maturity. and then maturity for everything. If a horse eats a bunch of really mature, either cool season or warm season grass, it's not nearly as digestible. What the issue we see here is we get into this teff grass or we get into Bermuda grass. It was baled, way too mature. It's really, really fine, so they can consume a bunch of it, and it can cause a compaction and maybe colic if we get a bunch of it tied up in their GI tract. So that's where we kind of see some of it in a lot of settings. So that goes back to maturity and making sure it's the right maturity, and so it's really easily digested. If it's too mature, it does not digest as easy. So telling you all that kind of sets us up for what we're talking about is way to utilize warm season grasses in our pastures. And so what we typically like to talk about, and every time we go out to visit a pasture, is talking about using rotational grazing. The least amount of labor you can put in is just to fence your perimeter and then open up the rest of your pasture, and horses can go wherever they want. You don't really have any labor as far as moving them around and around, but that's going to be the least productive method for your pasture. In order to really maximize your pasture, and it could be just because you want to keep your grasses alive, or you want to use all the forage that you can so you don't have to feed hay, rotational grazing is the key. Like I said, it can do two things. It can maximize your forage intake. So if you say, I only want to feed hay, 2 months out of the year when it's the middle of winter, the rest of the time I've got enough pasture space. I want to be able to utilize my pastures the rest of the time. So we could turn it into rotational grazing, where horses are on our cool season pastures during the time when they're actively growing, which would be the spring and the fall. And then we rotate them to our warm season pastures when we are during the summer, when the cool season are not actively growing. And the other part is if you just want to maintain your cool season pastures, you don't necessarily caring as much about how much they get off of it. You just want to maintain your cool season pastures. You get them off onto these warm season pastures, and that allows your other pastures to rest and survive. And so we get into kind of two different things that you can do. The big limiting factor in any rotational grazing system is water. And so that's what you have to think about. We could break this up into 50 paddocks, but they all have to have access to water, unless you're wanting to move it really intense grazing, where you're moving them almost by day or by hour, or by 2 or 3 hours, 4 hours. You're moving them from one paddock to another so they get access. Another thing would be during the spring when the grasses are really lush. If you're going to do a 2 or 3 hour rotation, they're probably getting enough moisture from that lush grass to sufficiently give them that adequate water before you move them to that next pasture. But the more intensively you graze it and break it up each one of these paddocks, the more you can get out of each one of your grasses. So in a situation like this, the one on the left-hand side, their water is at the center, and they've broken up all their pastures where they still have access to that water at the center point. And so in this situation, what I might do is I might plant 2 of these smaller paddocks over here in a Bermuda grass. So let's just say we put Bermuda grass in 2 of these. And so the rest of them, I'm going to have them with my tall fescue or cool season forages. So during the spring, once again, we don't measure, but we don't move our horses by time as much as we move them by the height of our grass. So as we start this process, these 2 are not going to be used during the spring because that grass is not actively growing. But the rest of these, we're going to use them during the spring and fall, maybe even to winter. So we're going to start moving them over here. We're going to let them come out here, graze this, and they may only be on there for 4 or 5 days. The grass, the first blade of grass starts to get below 3 inches. We're going to move them off of it and move them to that next pasture. And so we can rotate these horses through these pastures pretty quickly, because grass is actively growing. It's cool at night. We're getting enough rain. Sometimes we put on some nitrogen or fertilizer. So these grasses are recovering pretty quick. This is the premium time for grass to be growing. Remember that the 9 inches is kind of where we like to cap it off at, or where we start to see seed heads growing. So during the spring and fall, if it's prime growing season, we may have to come in here and move our horses even more rapidly, or we may have to come in here and clip some of these grasses, these paddocks, to keep those grasses in active growth. Like I said, if they go to that reproductive stage where they're putting seed heads on, then the quality of your grass really starts to go down. So as we rotate them by height. And like I said, during spring and fall, we may even have to come back and clip a few of these if we want to maintain them in vegetative growth where they're at their highest nutritional content. As we come around to summer, we start to see our summer grasses, our Bermuda is starting to take off, our fescue is starting to slow down. And so what we can do is start moving our horses into these Bermuda pastures and paddocks. And so when our fescue is really starting to struggle, we move them on here, and they can be on here still. We're not wanting to get below that 3 inches, but they may not eat nearly as much. So we can move them from this first Bermuda paddock, and we start to measure it again. We can move them over here. And so this Bermuda paddock may recover pretty rapidly, and we can move them back and forth. So you have the option of moving them back and forth between these Bermuda grasses because they can take wear and tear pretty well. Or you can still include your fescue in your rotation, just knowing that you're going to have to move them off of it much faster because it's not in an active growth. So let's say every 2 weeks you had them on this first tall fescue paddock in the spring and the fall. Well, in the summer, you may have to wait 6 to 8 weeks for that grass to recover back to the height you want. So you can still rotate them through here and maybe spend a little more time on these warm season paddocks and a little bit less time on each one of these. So you can either exclusively keep them off your fescue and maybe clip them if you have to, or you can continue to use them in your rotation, just making sure that you're going to have that yardstick ready to go, and realizing that time they get back to that paddock, it may take them 6 to 8 weeks to recover, where it only took you 2 weeks during the spring and fall. And I will say the same thing goes if you're using any of your pastures for hay. If you're cutting the hay for yourself, or if you have somebody come out there and cut the hay, use that same principle when it comes to measuring the hay. So a lot of times when somebody cuts hay, they cut it all the way down to the ground, to almost to the very root, trying to get all the hay they can. Well, it has that same principle. It's going to take a long time for it to get from 0 to 3 inches. And when we're talking about a hay season that, may be pretty restricted based on heat, if you can get 2 cuttings of hay because you left yours at 3 inches and it grew really fast from 3 inches to, let's say, 8 or 9 inches, it allowed you to get a second cutting of really good hay, because that second cutting is starting to go down in nutritional quality because its growing season is not as ideal. But if you can get one earlier, that's going to give you more hay, and it's going to give you a better quality. So you didn't necessarily recoup that by cutting it down to 0. Instead of, if you cut it to 3 inches, that allows you to have more hay, hopefully that next cutting, and higher quality hay. So you got somebody come out there to cut hay, ask them to cut it to 3 or 4 inches off the ground. That's going to give you a better chance for rapid growth and recovery. But the same thing goes for whether the horse grazes it or the mower grazes it. Keep it at that height. But either one of these can really help you maximize your paddocks. And then this also helps when we start talking about fall renovation. Having rotational grazing is another key. So we'll hit on rotational grazing at that point. But right now, what it does during the summer is it can give us some additional grazing, but also, more importantly, even it keeps them from destroying the rest of our paddocks that are cool season. So it can be rotational grazing can be really effective. It can be 2 paddocks is better than 1, 3 is better than 2, and on and on and on and on, however that goes. So a lot of it wants to be is how intensive do you want to be. Just putting a temporary electric fence works great. It does not have to be permanent fencing in here. Just a temporary electric fence works really well, and you can just rotate your tape along as you go to actually make your paddocks. So this is the biggest key to maximizing your pastures. This is what we try to talk to everybody about, is using rotational grazing will allow you to maximize everything that you get from your pastures, whether it's surviving or actually pulling forage off of. And so real quick, just to give you an idea in the planting time, we're talking about late spring, early summer, and just like everything else, it's not necessarily a time thing, it's more of indicators. So we get into soil temperature above 60, which we're probably pushing that right now, and an ambient temperature of 80, which we're definitely in those areas. So typically we would like to talk about mid-May, but we may be able to get some of it in a little bit earlier. But I would think mid-May to end of May would be a great time to be thinking about those Bermuda pastures, or if you want to go into some of the annuals. But Bermuda grass is a great grass to utilize during the summer, just because we get such great growth out of it, and it also allows our tall fescue to rest during the most stressful time of the year. So that's the end of our presentation on our summer survival. If there's any questions, I'll take that. I'll stop the recording. We'll take questions. But our next pasture management series will involve waste management. We'll get into that on Wednesday, June 7th at 12 o'clock. So if you have anybody that would like to participate, make sure they email me and we will get them registered for that.